In this multi-part series on Fetch XML, today I'll be covering Fetch XML usages. Now, once you have a Fetch XML code, at what places you can use this code to execute the Fetch XML code to retrieve the record from the backend Dataverse table. Now there are multiple places. So Power Apps. So Power Apps model driven app. So from here, Power Apps model driven app, you have an ability to download the fetch XML against a record. So I'm going to show that to you. There are multiple places through which you can download the fetch XML. So one is through the filter view and another is through the views. Power Pages liquid code. Here you can write the liquid code and then execute the fetch XML. So I've already covered a separate video in my Power Pages playlist. So you will find that video. Then we have Power Automate. So in Power Automate, there are many areas through which you can execute the fetch XML query. One of the connector is Dataverse. So within Dataverse connector, you will be able to specify the fetch XML query, and then you can execute that piece of code. Now, this is important because that will uh, reduce a number of action and it will make your flow look cleaner, and also it will perform an operation within just one action. Then we have pack CLI code. So here you can specify a command, a fetch XML command, and then you can execute the fetch XML code within the command line interface. OData fetch XML. So you can also specify fetch XML within a OData syntax, and then you can get that query executed. You can have a JavaScript code through which you can execute the fetch XML. So I've already covered this in one of the video. Reports. So in while creating a SSRS type of report, so while authoring an RDL report definition language file, you have to specify the fetch XML code, and then that will generate the report on basis of the fetch XML code. Now I don't have a demonstration of this because for that you need to install Visual Studio, and then from there you can view that interface, but I'll show that in the screenshot. Then within Power BI, even like you can specify the fetch XML just by getting the data through the web data source. So there are multiple places this fetch XML get used. Now these are some of the areas. Okay, this is not a comprehensive list. So let's go to the fetch XML for a model driven app. Now you have an option to download the fetch XML from the view itself, right? So if you go into any of the view within a model driven app, you have an option to download fetch XML. From a Power Pages perspective, I've already covered in one of my video in Power Pages. You can have a look into the playlist. Now here you need to specify a liquid tag fetch XML, and then specify the fetch XML. Now make sure that the fetch XML is properly well formed, and there is a ending tag end fetch XML. So if you have this code written, then you can technically run a fetch XML. So it automatically runs the fetch XML, and then once you get the output gets stored in this variable, whatever you specify. Now in my case it is xxxx. Now once you get that, you can query the variable and get the results. Okay, so this is how you utilize the fetch XML in Power Pages. Power Automate fetch XML, there is an option, there is a input button, like say if you see the input text, through which you can specify the fetch XML query to retrieve the records. In pack CLI, you have an option like pack env fetch, pack org fetch, dash dash XML, and then specify the XML and then get your fetch XML executed. OData interface. Now here, if you specify the entire URL, the environment URL slash API slash data v9.2 slash the logical name of the, not the logical name, but um, the the plural of the table, then you specify this contacts, and then you specify fetch XML equal to the fetch XML code. And then in JavaScript, you can use the fetch XML just by storing that text in a string variable. So as you see over here, this is the fetch XML code. Uh, Let me go back, and you append a query string fetch XML equal to. Now remember this case, it is case sensitive. So F is small, X is capital, and then you pass this to the retrieve multiple records, and you specify that variable, you can retrieve multiple records using fetch xml. And finally, in the Visual Studio Code interface, if you go into the report wizard, here you can specify the query, and the query can be that fetch xml. Okay, so that these are like multiple places through which fetch xml get used. Now in the model driven app, so this is the model driven app which I have created. So if you want to download a fetch xml related to this view, or maybe in another view, so let me show you owners and supervisors. So if this is the view through which you want to download the fetch xml, there are multiple places through which you can do. One is go to the edit filters and then click on download fetch xml. So if I click on download fetch xml, it will download that xml, and then you can view that fetch xml within the VS Code interface. Okay, so these are like some of the samples which I've already downloaded earlier. So you can open this file. Then if you go into this view, go to manage and share views, and then there is an option to download the fetch xml for whatever view you want, like inactive airlines or active airlines or aircrafts and stuff. So you can go ahead and download that fetch xml. Now from a model driven app, so this is like the backend table for that model driven app. Now in Power Pages, I have already created a page, and then within the page, if I want to execute the fetch xml, I can just go into the backend, edit the code in VS Code, and then from here it will start the authentication process. And then once I'm inside that Power Pages backend system, then I have an ability to write the fetch XML code. So it has already loaded this. So I've already written a piece of code. So as you see over here, fetch XML is the tag. It's a liquid tag. I have taken the output in a variable called a sum label, and then I have explicitly specified that fetch XML code end fetch XML, and then once this statement gets executed, the result gets stored in some label, and then after that you can iterate through that result set, like some label dot results dot entities dot size, if you want to know the size of the record set, like how many rows of record exist. Or you can use a for loop to extract all the variables, all the column names rather, like result dot full name, like whatever you specify as a column in the fetch xml query, you can get all this output. So if you want to know the full name, or if you want to know the job title, or if you want to know the state code, you can just go ahead and query those information. Coming to Power Automate Flow. Now in Power Automate Flow, if you want to specify the fetch XML, so take for example, if you've already created this fetch XML, so this is the simplest form of fetch XML. I'll just copy this. Now if you want to execute this is another place to execute the fetch XML. So maybe you go into the Dataverse and we just say, let me get into the connect of Dataverse and say list rows. So list rows, Microsoft Dataverse, and here you get an option to specify the fetch XML query. So I'll just paste the fetch XML query, and this is how it will look like. Now this is the old interface. You can go into the new interface and then perform that same operation, and it will allow you that as well. So just with a simple piece of code, you are telling Power Automate Dataverse connector list rows to uh, execute that query against that table. Make sure that you select the proper table name, which is exactly matching this entity name. Okay, else it might throw you an error. Now there are other ways, through JavaScript. Now I've already covered this in one of the videos. You can find that in my channel. Retrieve multiple record using fetch XML and JavaScript for model driven app. So if you see this piece of code, this is very simple piece of code. You just need to specify the fetch XML in a string. Now make sure that you put a query string, fetch XML equal to, and then you start writing your fetch XML code. Now, as you put this in a string, it's in double quotes, right? So make sure all your fetch XML strings are in single quote so that you can accommodate all these values within that particular double quotes enclosure. And then next step, simple XRM web API retrieve multiple records. Just pass that fetch XML variable, and then it will execute the fetch XML and it will give you that result. Alternatively, if you do not want to do all these things, there is a tool like named as Fetch XML Builder as a part of XRM toolbox. So I've already install that tool. So this is that fetch XML builder tool. Now here you can craft your own fetch XML using the UI. So you can specify if you want to add an entity or add a comment or add an attribute or a filter or an order or a link entity. You craft your query and then your query will be shown over here. You just execute this. Once you execute this, the result will be shown in this particular way. Now you have an option to show the metadata, the result type in the form of a grid or in the form of a web API JSON. So in this format, or maybe in the form of say homemade JSON, or maybe in the form of like multiple things. You can play around with these kind of interface. And then if you want to just see fetch XML, you just click on fetch XML, and this is how you can get those results. So these are the ways through which you can execute the fetch XML or download the fetch XML within different systems. So that's it, folks. That's all about fetch XML usages in the Power Platform system. Thanks for watching.